It's easier to believe in these words, right? When things are peaceful and everything seems to be going our way. We choose these songs these theme songs based on the things that we're going to talk about. And as I was reflecting on Wednesday nights when we have these rehearsals and I'm thinking about the song and how it connects to the message, I'm thinking it's easier when things are going our way. But the question that I have is, can we sing these words confidently in the midst of the many griefs we collect through the journey of life? Welcome to New Hope. We're so glad that you're here today. We're starting this brand new series called Mental, Rethinking How We Think About several aspects of our mental health. And I know that we're going to touch on a lot of things that many of you, that I am experiencing. Because at the end of the day, life and getting older every single day is accumulating the many griefs of life, don't you think? I interact a lot with my son. We talk about several things. He has lots of questions. He's 8 years old. Now, the questions that an 8-year-old asks is very different than a 4-year-old. Because my daughter, she's 4, she randomly asks questions like, "Daddy, are you married to mommy?" And I say, "Yeah." "Why?" "And because I love her." And why? And I have to be explaining these questions that she doesn't get. And you know how a 4-year-old thinks, 5-year-olds, and then you start getting mature. And my son, who's 8-year-old, he asks questions on politics, on the world war, the wars that are going on in the world, sports and biology and all these things. And as a parent, you start to figure out some questions you know the answers and some you don't. And it's very random at times, and it catches you off guard. Now, we were talking one day, and all of a sudden he asked me this question. He's saying, "Dad, can I choose what age I'll be in heaven?" And I'm like, oh man, that's a great question. You know how you don't think about these things? Kids see the world through different lenses, and he asked the question, can I choose what age I'll be in heaven? And then as I'm thinking about, let me think how to answer, he already interrupted me and said, "I want to be a kid." And then he added once again, "I want to be able to play." And to me, that was a very moving moment, because just pay attention to those words from a child, from an 8-year-old. He's thinking about heaven. He's thinking about what he wants to be. And for him, there is contentment and joy in being a child. Because when you're a kid, you're thinking about playing. You haven't seen the many griefs, right? There are children who have, but talking about my son particularly, there's much more innocence. And he has not carried the seriousness of disappointment that happens in life. And it touched me a lot, because I'm thinking and looking at him and I'm thinking, well, I want to be a kid too, But it moved me because as I'm looking at my child in all his innocence, I know that he's going to be disappointed in life. I know that the time will come when he's going to start accumulating griefs, and that innocence is going to go away, and he's going to face the real world. And that's why, as I was thinking about what to talk about in this series of mental health, I wanted to focus a little bit on grief. Now, why grief? I believe that many of us here have experienced, to some degree, grief in our life, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But first, we need some definitions, right? Because if I'm talking about grief, we have to understand a little bit what grief is. Now, by no means I'm a doctor, right? But trying to find the right sources to figure out how to talk about this, I'm learning through the process as well. And I came across this definition, that grief is the experience of coping with loss. I think that's the most mainstream definition that we face, right? That we hear is that if you lose somebody that you love, if you experience loss, then you go through a process of grieving, right? But it also adds that grief can accompany any event that disrupts or challenges our sense of normalcy or ourselves. So there's this extended definition that is not only about loss of a loved one in particular, but anything that disrupts your life, that changes the status quo. You feel there is a loss of something that affects you and who you are, your identity. And this ties very well with what Henry Nouwen, one of my favorite authors, he writes. He says that to grieve is to allow our losses to tear apart feelings of security and safety and lead us to the painful truth of our brokenness. He adds, our grief makes us experience the abyss of our own life in which nothing is settled, clear, or obvious, but everything is constantly shifting and changing. Are we good so far? Things are shifting. There are things that happen in life, losses that we have in life that changes the status quo. It disrupts the normalcy of life. C.S. Lewis writes, when he is writing a book mourning, grieving the passing of his wife, he says, no one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. Now, if you take in consideration what we just talked about this disruption of life and in facing somewhat of the unknown of what's going to happen from now on, yeah, there is an element of the feeling of fear of the unknown. The unknown, because your life has been disrupted by an event. Something has taken place. So with this in mind, we can say that grief is not necessarily the feeling of being very sad, because that's how it's associated usually. But grief is the process of finding meaning within the context of our sadness. There's a book by Jonathan Lear called Imagining the End, and he writes that mourning is a manifestation of human health. So it's a natural process of life. He adds by quoting, Sigmund Freud placed the capacity to mourn at the center of human well-being. And why is that? Because mourning shows that even at the extreme of suffering, the death of a loved one, we are actively trying to understand the meaning of our attachments. This activity counts as healthy because seeking to understand via making meanings is our characteristic activity. It is how we flourish even in times of pain and of grief. So if you're grieving right now by some aspect of a loss in your life, that's a human reaction. It's a healthy reaction of trying to find meaning in this disruption that has taken place in your life. Now, there are different kinds of grief. There are different kinds of grief. And when you open your Bible, it starts with this perfect world, creation, and everything is good. But then human beings, they make a mistake. They disobey. They're cast out of the garden. And they have to face this disruption of life. They cannot live anymore in this perfection of a world. But now this world has been interrupted by evilness and by everything that is terrible. And they have to understand how to live with this new reality of life. Now, when you read Genesis, everything is perfect, but then they eat the fruit. But in the midst of that chaos, God promises hope to them. God points forward to a promise that there is going to be resolution, that there is going to be a descendant that will come through the many generations that will eventually bring a solution to the evilness of the world. Now, as soon as we start chapter 4 of Genesis, it says that now Adam knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, and this time his brother Abel. So there's a new beginning in the life of this couple. There was this disruption, but now there's new possibilities. There's new life. Can you imagine for Eve in that context, giving birth for the first time? It was completely unknown. to have a baby in your belly, to give birth to a new child. Not only that, there is indication in the text that it's likely that she thought that that first child could have been already this promised descendant that will bring a solution to evil. But can you imagine the disappointment that that first child that was supposed to be at least this hope for this family ends up being the first murderer in the Bible? Text says, now Cain talked with Abel, his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. Imagine the pain. Imagine the grieving of Adam and Eve as they have to face this new reality, this disruption. Having joy with the first child, joy with the second child, but now this first child becomes a murderer and they have to face this new reality of life. Can you imagine that? So it starts. The first kind of grief that we find in the Bible is the grief after a loss, right? We see this. Losing someone that is so loved by you. And that is so common. We find it chapter after chapter. Abraham, a father of faith, it says, so Sarah died, his wife, in the land of Canaan, and Abram came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. A few chapters later, we have Rachel, who is Jacob's wife, died in childbirth. Can you imagine that? Losing the person that you love the most during childbirth. So Rachel died and was buried, and Jacob set a pillar on her grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. And there's so many other stories. When Jacob gets older and his children sell out his other son, Joseph, and they tell him that he was attacked by a wild beast, he feels the pain of losing a child, thinking that his child has died. So this is a kind of grief that is very common in the Bible. But that's not the only kind that we find. We see also the grief that we feel after mistakes, a different kind of grief. And a good example of this is the story of Peter and Jesus. Peter was this faithful servant, the disciple of Jesus. But Jesus said, Peter, when things get rough, you're going to betray me. And he says, no, I will not. Jesus says, when the rooster crows, you are going to betray me. And the text says, suddenly Jesus' words flashed through Peter's mind. Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went away weeping bitterly, feeling the grief of his mistake and trying to make sense of it all. We know in the story that eventually he was able to see Jesus again after those 3 days, but imagine that time of grief after his mistake. But that happens a lot. If you think about it, can you think about your relationships? Maybe because of your mistake, your marriage has been compromised and spouse has asked for a divorce. And because of your mistake, you have to grieve now the consequences of your actions. Or maybe because you were let go of your job because of something you did, mistakes, it happens. But now you have to face those consequences. Maybe you're grieving financial decisions that you made that have put you in a very tight spot right now. And you're trying to find meaning in all of these things. So grief after our mistakes is something that is common, and we find it in the Bible as well. There's a third kind of grief that I was looking into, and that is the grief after witnessing disaster, misery, injustice. Maybe you're the kind of person that you just turn off the news, you don't want to know about it, right? But I know many of you are the kinds of individuals who you want to see what's happening in the world. And when you see the wars that are taking place, when you see the famines that are happening, when you see injustice and all the misery that takes place in the world, it hurts you to the point that you feel that pain as well. You empathize to the extent that you grieve what's happening in the world. And that's a kind of grief as well. You have a prophet called Jeremiah in the Bible that he was supposed to be the spokesperson for God in a time that his nation was not doing what was right, and they were being conquered by nations and taken into slavery and doing a lot of chaos happening. And he writes My grief is beyond healing. My heart is broken. He continues and says, if only my head were a pool of water and my eyes a fountain of tears, I would weep day and night for all my people who have been slaughtered. He feels the pain. He's known as the crying prophet because he's mourning what's happening with his people. And by the way, you'll probably figure out that there are other kinds of grief, but I'm focusing on 4, and this is the 4th one, and that is the circumstantial grief. And that's things that just happen to you in life. Maybe it was not because of your mistake. Maybe you are the one who was betrayed, right? Maybe you were the one who faced injustice. Nothing that you did, but it's just the reality of the world that we live in today, that sometimes there are things that we have no control over. And I think a lot about the story of Joseph, who was betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery to a different nation. And he was there for a long time. And as he was having children there in Egypt, he was trying to find meaning by giving names to his children. And he gives names to his children. And after his second child, he says, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." So a lot of grief going on in Joseph's life, but he's trying to find meaning. His life was disrupted, but he's trying to find meaning. He's mourning. He is grieving the situation that he is in right now. So that can happen with injustice. That can happen with betrayal. That can just happen with the circumstance that you're in right now, and you're trying to wonder, why am I in this situation? It hurts me so much. The circumstances of life. Now, the Bible is a book that is relatable to the human experience. Is that what we learn from these stories, right? And I think that's the beauty of it. Because when we pick up a book like the Bible, yes, it was written a long time ago, and there are stories that we look and say, well, this doesn't happen nowadays. But if you look at the principle, right, of what it is happening in that story, it is very much relatable, because the whole purpose of the Bible is not only telling a story of hope, but telling a story with characters that we can all relate to. That when we read a story like that, we say, their story is my story. Even though it happened a long time ago, their story is my story, and I can relate very much with that. Now, if you're grieving, or if you've been through the process of grief, you know that there is a need, a desire to find some element of support, right? There is a need, a desire to feel understood. Now, I listen to a lot of music, and I had this Spotify just so I can remember that this is the illustration now. Have you heard a song that spoke to your heart a lot? I don't know how often that happens to you, but there's a song that has this meaning to you, and you love this song. It speaks to you in so many ways, and then you're wanting to share with people around you. And you share with people around you, and they're like, yeah, it's okay. It's a very disappointing thing, don't you think? That happens a lot to me. And at times I'm the one who says, yeah, it's okay. But whenever that happens, you know what I do? I go online, type the song on YouTube, and I go to the comment section. Why do I do that? Because in the comment section, there's a ton of people that are experiencing what I'm experiencing, right? They are sharing in the comment section what's happening. Like, how did that song speak to them? Their experience, their journey, how that song made a difference to them. In all of these interpretations of what that song can mean to other people who are reading the comment. That's why I love these comment sections for songs, because it's like we think we are not the only ones, right? We experience these things too. There are other people like myself that are seeing what I'm seeing and are being impacted in the way that I'm being impacted. And that's why, I say it again, there is a need, a desire to feel understood when we're going through this process of grief. And as we're looking at these stories that I touched on, the Bible, right? Like Abraham losing his spouse, and the experience of Joseph and all these things, one thing that stands out, and that was actually how this idea of talking about grief started for me, was they're very short descriptions, right? It's like you read that Abraham mourned for many days. It takes me 2 seconds, 3 seconds to say those words. But the man was mourning for many days or for many years. It's like we go to the next story, into the next story. So we go from one morning to the other morning to the other story, and there's another morning, and it goes by very fast. There's short descriptions. And one thing that we realize as we're studying the Bible is that there is an aspect of this relentlessness of time, that life is always moving on. Life is always moving on. And the grief that that person experienced, all of a sudden, feels like it's, from the reader's perspective, it goes away, and now there's another story, and there's another story. There's always another story of grief that follows. Now, this is what we need, right? Support, feeling understood. There's this human expectation when we are going through our grief. Because if you're going through something right now, or at least you're thinking about a time in your life that you are grieving, you can think that we don't want our grief to be overlooked. We don't want those close to us to simply pass by our grief with indifference. We don't want those close to us to simply pass our grief with indifference, and we don't want our experience to be minimized. Where is it? There you go. We don't want our grief to be overlooked. We don't want those to see our grief with indifference. And finally, we don't want our experience to be minimized. So the question that I have for all of you is, what can we do to make sure that those around us don't feel that way? What can we do for people not to feel that their grief is being minimized, that we don't overlook what people are going through in their grief? What can we do? Brené Brown writes, sometimes the bravest and most important thing you can do is just show up. There's a man who has been chaplain for a long time, and he was asked, how can someone help a loved one who is experiencing loss and grief? How can someone help? And he responded by saying, be fully present. Really focus on the person and what they are saying, and don't be concerned about what you're thinking or what you're going to say. You know what I mean, right? I think most of us has been there trying to fix and try to be the urge to say and fix the situation. Tell me more. How are you feeling right now? Focus on validating and affirming them and not giving your own opinions or advice. I think it's important for us to either know this or be reminded of this. I know I have to be reminded of these things very often, because there's the tendency, right, to jump in, to give opinions, to try to fix. He writes, most of us need to have our grief witnessed and validated by others. Ignoring or suppressing our emotions and thoughts can cause prolonged grief and a sense of suffering. And what he's talking about ties very well with what Henry Nouwen writes when he says that when we honestly ask ourselves which persons in our lives mean the most to us, we often find out that it's those who, instead of giving much advice, solutions, or cures, they have chosen rather to share our pain, touch our wounds with a gentle and tender hand. The friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness. That is the friend who cares. Isn't that beautiful? Kind of like a direction on how we should relate to one another in the griefs that we all carry. Now, we're talking about what we can do, right? Be fully present. Not trying to fix everything, but being fully present, listening, empathy, and all these things. But it's inevitable that there is a human limitation. Why is there a human limitation? Because we don't have abundance of time and energy to help everyone around us to the full extent of their expectations. Now, I say this because as I go back to 2020, and you know that was a chaotic year, right? I was pastoring back in New Mexico, and when COVID started spreading and lockdowns, for a pastor at the time, it was a very challenging time, right? Because it increased the need that people had for emotional connection. It increased the need that people had for some sort of support. And even though we had our team of myself as a pastor and elders, it was very hard to keep up with every single person. I don't know if you felt that way, but I remember it was a very overwhelming time. Because not only am I trying to make sense of everything that is going on in my own life, my responsibility was to make sure that the members of my church, they were being taken care of as well. And I remember that I tried calling every single person. I tried to visit as many people as I could. But one thing that I knew for sure is that it wasn't enough. I couldn't do it on my own. So during COVID, it was a hard time because I couldn't do it on my own. And I don't know if you felt that way before. Maybe in different phases of your life that so much is happening. You see the problems of others around you, but you have problems yourself. There is chaos in the family. There is chaos in the workplace. And you just wish that you had more time or you had more availability to be helping more people. Have you ever felt that way? It's an overwhelming experience. And there is a human limitation to how many things we can do. Now, in this context of human limitation, I always like to look at this phrase that Jesus says, very famous phrase that gives us some aspect of comfort. And that is when Jesus says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary, who are tired, and carry heavy burdens." And he says, and I will give you rest. Now, when did Jesus say these words? So Jesus spoke about this. There was a context of religiosity. And what do I mean by that? Is that when Jesus was talking about this, he was taking consideration the context where the religious leaders of the time were giving too many expectations, too many burdens to those around. So people, to be close to God, they felt that they needed to do all these things by themselves. They had all these checklists that they needed to check to make sure that they were good with God. They were carrying heavy burdens. So in this context of religiosity, they were being asked to do it on their own. There was an aspect of reliance on self to fix your problems. And that's why even though there is a context of religiosity in these words of Jesus, it is applicable to the various other areas of life. Because when we think about grief, when we think about the struggles that we go on in life, we can also say that we cannot do it by ourselves. There's an author, Søren Kierkegaard, philosopher, Danish philosopher, that writes a book called Practicing Christianity. And right in the beginning of his book, he addresses this passage of Jesus making this invitation. And I just think it's a beautiful view of the words of Jesus, because he starts focusing on the first words that come out of Jesus' mouth, and that is the "come to me." Because usually when we have a problem, if it's a medical problem or if it's some kind of problem, our tendency as human beings is we go look for help, right? We call the doctor, we do this, we call that, we look for help. But Jesus is the one who takes the initiative. He is the one who comes and says, come to me, because he knows what we go through. So he makes the invitation, come to me. But the second part of the text that is beautiful is the fact that Jesus says, come to me, who? All of you. So this passage addresses the human limitation. Pastor Andre, I can't make that invitation to anybody. I can't invite everyone. There are limitations to what I can do. But the beautiful thing is that not only Jesus is the one who takes the initiative to make this invitation, but he is the only one who can make the invitation to all. That's the difference between the human limitation and what God can do. Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. I will give you rest. And he closes this idea by saying that the helper is the help. The helper is the help. Instead of pointing to that direction, there is an element that Jesus has something to offer all of us. Now, I need to emphasize one thing, because I don't want there to be any confusion. And that is, embracing this promise doesn't eliminate the importance of professional help when needed. Okay? Maybe you're going through something right now. You can't make it on your own. God makes this invitation, but you still need professional help. And that professional help will help you navigate the griefs. It'll help you navigate this disruption of life and help you find some clarity in the things that you've been experiencing. So this passage by no means eliminates the importance of professional help when needed. But what can this invitation do for all of us? It's something very simple. When we read this invitation of Jesus, come to me, all of you who are tired and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest, it means that it's experiencing comfort through faith that we are never alone in our grief. It's finding solace in someone who understands the very depths of what we're going through. The Jesus who invites us to find rest in him is someone who empathizes with our grief. And there's a lot of examples that we see. When Jesus loses a friend called Lazarus, you know this because it's the shortest verse in the Bible. It just simply says that Jesus wept. He knows how to feel the things that we feel. When he saw a woman who had lost her only son, text says that he saw her and his heart was overflowed with compassion. When he saw a man who was a leper, that was an outcast of society and had to deal with this disruption of his life, it says that moved with compassion, Jesus reached out and touched him and said, I am willing to heal you. And he said, be healed. The book of Hebrews says that Jesus understands our weaknesses. He understands what we go through. He understands the journey. He understands the depths of who we are. So, we hold on to this promise of rest for the now until we finally experience it in its fullness in the life to come. And that's why it brings me back to the question that my son asked me a while ago. And the question was, can I choose what age will be in heaven, Dad? As I was remembering that interaction, I think my answer was simply, I really don't know, son. Maybe. There are things that the Bible doesn't talk about, and we can just wonder what the answers of those questions are. Can we choose the age that we will be in heaven. I don't know. But as I was reflecting on this interaction with my son later, I kept thinking about one other promise, because there are things that we don't know. There are things that we can read from cover to cover, and the answers will not be provided. But there is a promise that the Bible talks about. One thing that we can know, and one thing that I've shared with my son since then, and that is that he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, from our eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things will be gone forever. In the uncertainty of life, in the trying to figure out what everything means and trying to cope with our pain, our griefs, hold on to this future promise, but also know that for the now, there is a God who is working now, and that through faith, we can have the comfort in the one who knows the depths of our heart, the one who listens to us in the times when it feels that nobody else is. We can rely on the invitation. Come to me, all of you who are tired and carry heavy burdens. I will give you rest. Let me pray with you. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time, for this opportunity to be reminded, to learn a little bit more about your love and about what you do for us. Help us navigate the pain. Help us navigate the grief. Help us find meaning in the disruptions of life. I know it's very hard, and there are different degrees of pain that all of us here experience. But help us all find the same rest that you all promise us. Thank you for being there for us in the dark times. Thank you for reminding us and helping us with our lack of faith at times to believe in these things. And even in the times that we can't have the strength to believe, Lord, thank you for never giving up on us. This is our prayer. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.